What if I told you the first recorded peace treaty in human history wasn't signed in a sleek modern boardroom, but etched onto a silver tablet over 3,000 years ago? Picture two ancient superpowers, Egypt and the Hittite Empire, locked in a bloody conflict that stretched across generations, with battles so fierce they reshaped the landscape of the ancient Near East. Then, in a stunning turn of events, these sworn enemies did the unthinkable. They chose peace. The Egyptian-Hittite peace treaty isn't just a relic of the past. It's a masterclass in diplomacy, written in an era when war was often seen as the only language of power. This treaty, carved in stone and sealed with oaths to the gods, didn't just end a war. It rewrote the rules of engagement. Think about that for a moment. At a time when empires expanded through conquest, these two civilizations sat down and negotiated terms that recognized each other's sovereignty, established boundaries, and even included clauses for mutual aid. It's a blueprint for cooperation so advanced, it wouldn't feel out of place in today's diplomatic circles. How did they achieve this? What compelled these ancient rulers, Pharaoh Ramses II and King Hattusili III, to prioritize peace over victory? And what can their story teach us about resolving conflicts in our own divided world? As we unravel the secrets of this ancient agreement, you'll discover how diplomacy thrived long before modern treaties or international courts. This wasn't just about ending hostilities, it was about building trust across cultures, languages, and generations. The treaty's survival through wars, empires rising and falling, and the slow erosion of time speaks to its enduring power. So let's step back into the world of chariots, clay tablets, and royal envoys to uncover how humanity's first great peace deal changed history and why its lessons still resonate today. To understand just how extraordinary this peace treaty was, we need to step into the turbulent world of the Late Bronze Age, a time when empires rose and fell like waves crashing against the shore. The Mediterranean and Near East were a chessboard of competing kingdoms, with Egypt and the Hittites as the two most formidable players. Pharaoh Ramses II ruled over an Egypt at the height of its power, its wealth flowing from gold mines and fertile Nile floods. Meanwhile, the Hittite Empire, centered in modern-day Turkey, controlled vast trade routes and boasted an iron-fisted military. These weren't just neighbors, they were superpowers in a high-stakes game of territory and prestige. The tensions between them reached a boiling point at the Battle of Kadesh around 1274 BCE, a clash so monumental that both sides claimed victory. Ramses II immortalized it on temple walls, depicting himself as a lone hero against Hittite hordes, while Hittite records painted a very different picture. But beneath the propaganda, one truth became clear: neither side could deliver a knockout blow. The war dragged on for years, draining resources, destabilizing borders, and leaving both empires vulnerable. Imagine two heavyweight fighters, bruised and exhausted, realizing that continuing the fight would only lead to mutual collapse. That's when something remarkable happened. Instead of doubling down on conquest, Ramses and Hattusili III did something almost unheard of in their era. They chose negotiation over annihilation. This wasn't a sudden change of heart, it was a calculated move born of necessity. Rebellions simmered within their own borders, rival kingdoms eyed their weaknesses, and the cost of war had become too high. But here's what's fascinating: their solution wasn't just a temporary truce. It was a meticulously crafted agreement that addressed everything from prisoner exchanges to mutual defense pacts, proving that even in an age of swords and chariots, diplomacy could be as sharp as any blade. The story of how this 3,000-year-old peace treaty resurfaced in modern times reads like an archaeological detective novel. In the early 19th century, as European explorers began peeling back the layers of ancient civilizations, fragments of the treaty emerged from two distant corners of the Mediterranean. At the great temple complex of Karnak in Egypt, towering hieroglyphic inscriptions told one version of the story, etched into stone by Ramses II's artisans as a permanent monument to his legacy. Meanwhile, over 700 miles to the north in what is now Turkey, German archaeologists sifting through the ruins of Hattusili, the Hittite capital, discovered a very different artifact: fragile clay tablets covered in precise cuneiform script, preserved by chance when the city's royal archives were baked hard by the fires that consumed the palace centuries earlier. These parallel discoveries gave scholars something extraordinary: a rare opportunity to compare how each empire framed the agreement through their own cultural lens. The Egyptian version, carved with dramatic flair on temple walls, naturally portrayed Ramses as the magnanimous victor, granting peace to a humbled Hittite king. But the Hittite tablets revealed a more balanced negotiation, showing how Hattusili skillfully positioned himself as an equal partner. One particularly telling difference appears in the treaty's famous mutual defense clause. The Egyptian text emphasizes protecting Hittite lands from foreign threats, while the Hittite version frames it as a two-way street with equal obligations on both sides. This wasn't just ancient propaganda, it was a masterstroke of diplomacy, allowing each ruler to present the terms in a way that saved face with their own people while still honoring the agreement's core principles. What's truly astonishing is how these fragile records endured. The Karnak inscriptions survived because they were literally set in stone, meant to awe generations of Egyptians with their ruler's greatness. But the Hittite tablets, their preservation is nothing short of miraculous. These sun-dried clay documents should have crumbled to dust within centuries, yet when Hattusili's palace burned during the empire's collapse around 1200 BCE, the intense heat accidentally fired the clay, turning what should have been temporary administrative records into permanent historical witnesses. Even the silver tablet mentioned in the treaty's text, reportedly exchanged between the kings as an official copy, hasn't been found, likely melted down for its precious metal value long ago. That we have any record at all is a testament to how seriously both civilizations took this agreement, ensuring its terms would echo far beyond their lifetimes. The survival of these documents speaks volumes about the treaty's significance. In an age when most diplomatic agreements were verbal or written on perishable materials, Ramses and Hattusili deliberately chose mediums meant to last: stone for public display, clay for royal archives. They understood this wasn't just another temporary truce, but a foundational shift in how empires could relate to one another. Today, as scholars painstakingly piece together fragments from both versions, we're not just reconstructing an ancient text, we're recovering a watershed moment in human history when two superpowers chose dialogue over destruction and proved that even the bitterest rivals could find common ground. The treaty's structure reveals just how sophisticated ancient diplomacy could be. Far from a simple handshake agreement, this was a carefully crafted document that tackled everything from border security to humanitarian concerns. At its core, the treaty opened with what we'd now call a preamble, but with a distinctly Bronze Age twist. Instead of dry legal introductions, it named the parties in grand fashion: Ramses, the great king of Egypt, and Hattusili, the great king of Hatti, establishing their equal status right from the start. This wasn't just protocol, it was a deliberate signal that neither empire would submit to the other. What followed were clauses so pragmatic they wouldn't seem out of place in a modern treaty. The Non-Aggression Pact formed the backbone, a promise that neither side would invade the other's territory or support rebellions against their rule. But the real stroke of genius came with the Military Alliance Clause. If either kingdom faced external threats, the other was obligated to send troops, an ancient version of collective security that transformed former enemies into strategic partners. Even more surprising were provisions for handling fugitives. Nobles who defected were to be returned, but commoners could stay, suggesting a nuanced understanding of political asylum that considered both stability and human dignity. Perhaps the most fascinating element was how they enforced compliance. Without international courts or sanctions, they turned to divine witnesses, a celestial roll call of Egyptian and Hittite gods who'd supposedly punish any oath breaker. This wasn't mere superstition, it was psychological genius. By invoking deities from both pantheons, they created a shared spiritual accountability that crossed cultural lines. The treaty even included a curse for violators. Whoever does not observe these words, may the 1,000 gods destroy his house, his land, and his servants. Imagine the weight of that threat in a world where people believed gods actively shaped their fate. What's striking is how these ancient diplomats balanced concrete political needs with symbolic gestures. They didn't just exchange documents, they staged elaborate ratification ceremonies where envoys read the terms aloud before crowds, turning legal text into public spectacle. Silver copies were reportedly sent between capitals, not just as records but as tangible symbols of trust. This blend of practical detail and ritual symbolism created an agreement that worked on multiple levels, as a military strategy, a political framework, and a cultural bridge. In many ways, it set the template for how complex societies could negotiate peace, not through domination, but through mutual recognition of each other's legitimacy. The treaty's enduring legacy lies in this duality. It functioned as both a binding contract and a sacred covenant, appealing to rulers' political instincts while tapping into deep-seated religious beliefs. That combination gave it staying power. Where temporary truces might have collapsed under pressure, this agreement held firm for generations. Even today, as we pass its clauses, we're not just reading ancient history, we're seeing the roots of diplomacy itself, where trust is built not just through words, but through systems that make peace more valuable than war. At the heart of this ancient peace deal lay a principle so straightforward yet groundbreaking: mutual non-aggression. But don't mistake its simplicity for naivety. This wasn't just a vague promise to stop fighting. It was a meticulously designed safeguard against every conceivable spark that could reignite hostilities. The treaty's architects recognized that outright invasions weren't the only threat. Subversion, espionage, and proxy wars could unravel peace just as easily. So they drafted clauses forbidding not only direct attacks but also any covert support for rebellions within each other's territories. Imagine the foresight that went into this. Two empires acknowledging that true peace meant closing every backdoor to conflict. What makes this even more remarkable is how they addressed the elephant in the room, the delicate issue of defectors. Noblemen fleeing one kingdom for the other had to be repatriated, preventing exiled aristocrats from becoming pawns in future power struggles. Yet commoners were allowed to stay, a nuance that balanced political stability with compassion. This wasn't just legalistic nitpicking, it was a profound understanding of human behavior and power dynamics. By cutting off avenues for indirect aggression, Ramses and Hattusili didn't just end a war, they built a system where maintaining peace became more advantageous than breaking it. The treaty's brilliance shines in its anticipation of modern geopolitical strategies. Today, we see nations wage shadow wars through economic pressure or cyber attacks, methods not so different from the ancient fear of covert rebellions. The Hittites and Egyptians, lacking satellites or digital networks, still grasped that lasting peace required plugging every leak in the boat, their solution. Make betrayal unappealing by tying both empires' fates together. If either side violated the terms, they wouldn't just face earthly consequences, they'd risk divine retribution from a coalition of gods. This celestial enforcement mechanism turned the treaty into something sacred, elevating it beyond mere politics to a covenant neither dared break. Consider how radical this was for its time. Most Bronze Age conflicts ended with one side's submission or a temporary ceasefire until the next harvest season. But here, two superpowers chose mutual restraint as a long-term strategy, recognizing that endless war weakened them both. Their non-aggression pact became the foundation for something even more unexpected: active cooperation. With the threat of conflict off the table, they could focus on shared interests like trade and stability, proving that sometimes the most powerful weapon in diplomacy isn't a sword, but a well-crafted promise. The military alliance clause in the Egyptian-Hittite treaty wasn't just an addendum. It was a revolutionary stroke of geopolitical strategy that transformed sworn enemies into guardians of each other's survival. Picture this: after decades of bloodshed, these two empires didn't merely agree to stop fighting. They pledged to defend one another against external threats, creating an ancient equivalent of a mutual insurance policy against invasion. This wasn't a vague promise whispered in some dimly lit palace corridor. It was etched in stone and clay with precise terms. If a third party attacked either kingdom, the other would dispatch infantry, chariots, and supplies without hesitation. What's astonishing is how this mirrored the very principles that underpin modern alliances like NATO. The Hittites and Egyptians grasped a truth that still resonates today: security isn't just about your own borders, but the stability of your neighbors. When Hattusili III faced rebellions in his western territories, Egypt could have exploited his vulnerability. Instead, Ramses honored their pact, recognizing that a weakened Hittite empire would invite chaos along their shared frontier. This wasn't altruism, it was cold, calculated realism. By intertwining their fates, they created a deterrent so powerful that potential aggressors thought twice before testing either empire. The brilliance of this arrangement lay in its reciprocity. Unlike the tribute systems common at the time, where weaker states paid off stronger ones for protection, this was a partnership of equals. Both sides brought something irreplaceable to the table. Egypt's vast wealth and naval reach complemented the Hittites' formidable army and control over Anatolian trade routes. Together, they formed a defensive web that stretched from the Nile Delta to the Black Sea, making the entire region a far harder target for opportunistic invaders. But here's where the treaty showed its true sophistication. The Mutual Defense Clause wasn't triggered automatically. It required formal requests and consultations, much like modern alliances debating Article 5. Clay tablets discovered at Hattusa reveal detailed protocols for how aid would be requested, ensuring neither party could drag the other into unnecessary conflicts. This wasn't a blind pledge. It was a system built on accountability and measured response, preventing the kind of entangling alliances that would later plague European diplomacy. Perhaps most striking is how this ancient pact anticipated the concept of collective security millennia before the League of Nations or United Nations existed. By making peace interdependent, the treaty removed the temptation for short-term betrayal. Attacking one empire meant facing both, a calculus so daunting it preserved the peace for generations. In an era when treaties were often broken as easily as they were made, this alliance held firm because it made cooperation more valuable than conquest. The lesson for our world: Lasting peace isn't just about ending hostilities, it's about creating structures where maintaining trust becomes the most rational choice for all involved. Among the treaty's most forward-thinking provisions was its handling of fugitives, a clause that reveals just how deeply these ancient rulers understood the political volatility of human movement. The agreement stipulated that high-ranking defectors, particularly nobles or military leaders, had to be returned to their homeland if they sought refuge across the border. This wasn't about petty criminals or common thieves. It was a strategic measure to prevent exiled elites from becoming catalysts for future rebellions. Imagine a disgruntled Hittite prince fleeing to Egypt, only to be sent back under armed escort, a stark message that neither empire would tolerate becoming a safe haven for the other's political instability. But here's where the treaty showed surprising nuance. While powerful defectors faced mandatory repatriation, the agreement explicitly allowed everyday citizens, farmers, artisans, even low-ranking soldiers to remain where they settled. This distinction between political actors and ordinary people suggests an almost modern understanding of asylum. The rulers recognized that while elites could threaten their regimes, commoners posed little risk and might even contribute to the economy. It's a reminder that even in an age of absolute monarchy, practical considerations sometimes outweighed pure authoritarianism. The fugitive clause also exposes a timeless tension in diplomacy, the balance between control and compassion. On one hand, both empires sought to clamp down on dissent by denying rivals any advantage. On the other, they acknowledged that mass population transfers could destabilize regions and spark resentment. Some scholars argue this provision inadvertently created one of history's earliest recorded protections for economic migrants, a far cry from today's heated debates over border policies, yet rooted in similar practical concerns. What makes this especially fascinating is how it reflects the Bronze Age's interconnected world. Defectors weren't just political pawns, they carried valuable intelligence about military tactics, trade routes, and court intrigues. By controlling their movement, Ramses and Hattusili weren't just managing dissent, they were safeguarding state secrets. This delicate dance between security and humanity shows that even 3,000 years ago, the movement of people across borders was never just a legal issue, but a deeply human one with ripple effects across empires. The treaty's most ingenious enforcement mechanism wasn't an army or a wall, it was a divine courtroom. By invoking the gods of both Egypt and Hatti as witnesses, Ramses and Hattusili transformed their agreement from a mere political document into a sacred covenant, one that carried consequences far beyond the reach of mortal punishment. Picture the scene. As scribes etched the treaty's terms, they listed deities from both pantheons: Egypt's sun god Ra alongside the Hittite storm god Teshub, creating a celestial jury that spanned cultures. This wasn't just poetic flair, it was psychological warfare against betrayal. In a world where people believed gods actively shaped droughts, plagues, and military defeats, the threat of divine retribution held more terror than any earthly penalty. What's striking is how meticulously the treaty wove together two very different religious traditions. The Egyptian version called upon the mountains and rivers of Egypt, the sky, the earth, the great sea, the winds, and the clouds, while the Hittite text named over 1,000 gods from their sprawling pantheon. This wasn't a casual nod to spirituality. It was a deliberate strategy to make the agreement feel binding across cultures. Imagine being a Hittite noble contemplating betrayal, knowing that not only your own gods but Egypt's might turn against you. The psychological weight of that dual condemnation made violating the treaty unthinkable on a visceral level. The curses themselves read like something from an ancient thriller. Whoever does not observe these words, may the 1,000 gods destroy his house, his land, and his servants. May they crush him like a clay pot beneath their feet. But here's the twist: these weren't empty threats. Bronze Age societies interpreted natural disasters or military defeats as signs of divine displeasure. When a plague later struck the Hittite heartland, scholars suspect many saw it as confirmation of the gods' watchfulness over the treaty's terms. This spiritual enforcement system worked precisely because both cultures shared a fundamental belief that the cosmos itself would punish oath breakers. Yet beneath the thunderous divine warnings lay a subtler brilliance. By including each other's gods, the treaty acknowledged something radical for its time: that foreign deities held real power. In an era when conquering armies often smashed rival idols, this mutual recognition of divine legitimacy became its own form of respect. A Hittite envoy might not worship Ra, but he'd think twice before violating an oath sworn in the sun god's name. This spiritual diplomacy created a shared sacred space where both empires could meet, not as victor and vanquished, but as equals under the gaze of heaven. The lasting lesson here isn't about superstition, but about understanding what truly motivates human behavior. Modern treaties rely on courts and sanctions, but the Egyptian-Hittite agreement tapped into something deeper: the fear of cosmic judgment. It reminds us that effective diplomacy doesn't just address political realities. It speaks to the values and beliefs that shape how people see the world. When two empires could align their spiritual and strategic interests so completely, peace wasn't just a policy, it became a sacred duty. Imagine setting off on a journey where every mile could mean life or death, where the scrolls in your possession held the fate of empires, and where a single mistranslated word might reignite a war. This was the reality for the envoys who shuttled between Egypt and Hattusili, men who served as the ancient world's living telegraph wires. Without satellites or instant messages, these messengers embarked on grueling expeditions that could last half a year, crossing deserts, mountains, and war-torn frontiers just to deliver a single draft of the treaty. Their caravans weren't just carrying clay tablets and papyrus, they were transporting the fragile hope of peace itself. These envoys were far more than royal postmen. Selected from the highest echelons of court, they were polyglots who spoke Akkadian, the diplomatic lingua franca of the Bronze Age, and understood the intricate dance of protocol. A misstep in etiquette, like failing to prostrate correctly before Pharaoh or address a Hittite prince with his full titles, could derail months of negotiations. Their role demanded an almost supernatural ability to read rooms across cultures, smoothing over tensions when a king's pride bristled at a proposed clause, or when translators struggled to convey nuances between cuneiform and hieroglyphs. The logistical challenges alone were staggering. Surviving records from Hattusili describe envoys traveling with armed escorts, scribes, and even physicians, a mobile diplomatic corps prepared for everything from bandit attacks to dysentery. They carried not just treaty drafts but lavish gifts: gold from Egypt's mines, silver from Hittite treasuries, all meant to sweeten the deal and prove each empire's sincerity. One particularly tense moment came when Hattusili's sister, a princess skilled in diplomacy, was sent to Ramesses' court, a move that blurred the line between envoy and political hostage. What's truly astonishing is how these ancient diplomats developed techniques we still use today. They pioneered the concept of iterative negotiation, where each envoy brought back counter-proposals for their king's consideration, slowly narrowing differences through cycles of discussion. Clay tablets from Hattusili reveal how they even established early confidentiality protocols, with messengers instructed to burn certain sensitive documents after reading them aloud. This wasn't just improvisation, it was the birth of professional diplomacy, where trust was built through painstaking repetition and face-to-face rapport. Their greatest legacy lies in how they transformed communication from a barrier into a bridge. When linguistic hurdles arose, they devised workarounds using visual symbols on treaty drafts or relying on third-party interpreters from neutral city-states. At one critical juncture, when both sides deadlocked over territorial claims, the envoys proposed a creative compromise. Instead of fixating on disputed towns, they reframed the border along a natural river boundary. This stroke of problem-solving genius shows how these ancient intermediaries didn't just relay messages, they shaped them, proving that even in an age of chariots and clay, human ingenuity could find pathways to peace. The risks they took were monumental. One Hittite tablet recounts how an entire delegation perished in the Sinai, their bodies and documents lost to a sandstorm. Another describes an Egyptian envoy who fell gravely ill in Anatolia, delaying ratification for months until a replacement could be sent. Yet despite these hardships, the system worked because both empires invested in something we often overlook today: the slow, deliberate cultivation of mutual understanding. In our era of instant communication, their story reminds us that some negotiations can't be rushed, and that the most enduring agreements are often forged not through speed, but through the patient labor of those willing to traverse deserts, both literal and metaphorical, to make peace possible. For Ramses II, the peace treaty wasn't just an end to hostilities, it was a masterclass in political spin. After the brutal stalemate at Kadesh, where his forces had narrowly escaped disaster, the pharaoh faced a delicate problem: how to sell peace to a population raised on tales of Egypt's invincibility. His solution: transform a compromise into a coronation. Across temples from Abu Simbel to Karnak, artisans carved scenes depicting Ramses not as a negotiator, but as a conqueror graciously offering terms to a supplicant Hittite king. The hieroglyphic version of the treaty carefully framed every clause as Egyptian largesse, with phrases like, "The great ruler of Egypt grants peace," reinforcing the illusion of dominance. This wasn't mere vanity, it was survival. In an era when pharaohs derived their authority from divine military prowess, admitting parity with a foreign power could have destabilized Ramses' rule. So he weaponized the treaty's symbolism. When Hattusili later sent his daughter to marry the pharaoh, Ramses turned the diplomatic marriage into a propaganda spectacle, commissioning reliefs that showed Hittite princes bowing with gifts as if paying tribute. Even the silver tablet copy of the treaty, exchanged between the kings, became a prop in this theater. Its very material, a metal associated with the moon god Thoth, subtly reinforcing Ramses' narrative of celestial endorsed supremacy. Yet beneath the bravado lay shrewd pragmatism. While publicly playing the victor, Ramses privately honored the treaty's equal terms, sending grain shipments during Hittite famines and extraditing rebel nobles as promised. This duality reveals a timeless truth about diplomacy. What matters isn't just the agreement itself, but the stories leaders tell about it. By letting Hattusili save face in substance while claiming victory in spectacle, Ramses achieved something remarkable. He gave his people the glory they craved while securing the stability his empire needed. The lesson echoes through history. Sometimes the most effective peacemakers are those who understand that perception and reality must both be managed, and that allowing your adversary their dignity can be the price of lasting peace. Hattusili III played a far more dangerous game than Ramses could have imagined. While the Egyptian pharaoh used the treaty to bolster his image, the Hittite king needed it for survival. His rise to power hadn't followed the traditional path. He'd seized the throne from his nephew amid whispers of illegitimacy, leaving factions within his court simmering with resentment. For Hattusili, peace with Egypt wasn't just about ending a war. It was about removing distractions so he could tighten his grip at home. The eastern frontier had been bleeding Hittite resources for years, with Assyria eyeing their weakened state. But the real threats lurked closer: disloyal governors in Syria, rebellious vassal kings in western Anatolia, even murmurs of assassination plots in his own palace. By securing his southern border through the treaty, Hattusili freed up troops and gold to crush internal dissent. Clay tablets from Hattusa reveal his strategy. Garrisons once stationed against Egypt were quietly redeployed to rebellious cities like Tahantasa, while the grain once stockpiled for long campaigns was diverted to win over restive populations. What's striking is how he leveraged the treaty's prestige to legitimize his rule. Official proclamations began emphasizing his role as peacemaker, framing the agreement not as compromise but as statesmanship. When critics questioned his right to rule, Hattusili could point to his correspondence with Ramses sealed with royal insignia and addressed to "my brother, the great king," as proof of his international standing. The treaty became his shield against domestic rivals. After all, who could challenge a king recognized by Egypt's mighty pharaoh? But the masterstroke came in how he used the pact to reshape Hittite society. With external threats minimized, Hattusili launched sweeping legal reforms, standardizing laws across his fractured empire. Surviving tablets show how he tied these changes to the peace dividend. Now that our borders are secure by the will of the gods, let justice prevail in the land. It was a brilliant pivot, channeling the stability won through diplomacy into lasting institutional power. The treaty's mutual defense clause served him unexpectedly well. When rebel factions in Carchemish sought Assyrian backing, Hattusili invoked the pact, forcing Ramses to at least feign support. Though Egyptian troops never marched north, the mere threat cooled Assyrian ambitions, buying Hattusili time to suppress the uprising. This revealed the treaty's hidden value. Even its imperfect enforcement created psychological deterrence, allowing both kings to focus on their most pressing crises. Hattusili's story reminds us that ancient diplomacy wasn't just about empires talking. It was about rulers juggling countless internal pressures while projecting strength. His success lay in recognizing that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't an army at your border, but a signed agreement that lets you turn your attention inward. Where Ramses used the treaty to polish his legend, Hattusili used it as scaffolding to rebuild a fractured kingdom, proving that peace could be as transformative as any conquest. The two surviving versions of the Egyptian-Hittite treaty tell a fascinating story about how history gets written by the victors, or in this case by both sides claiming victory. When archaeologists first compared the Egyptian hieroglyphs at Karnak with the Hittite cuneiform tablets from Hattusa, they discovered these weren't just translations in different languages, but entirely different narratives crafted for domestic consumption. The Egyptian text opens with Ramses II declaring he grants peace to the Hittites, using verbs that imply magnanimity from a position of strength. Hieroglyphic carvings accompanying the treaty show the Hittite king's envoys bowing deeply, their arms raised in a gesture of submission, a visual reinforcement of Pharaoh's preferred storyline. Yet the Hittite version paints a starkly contrasting picture. Their tablets describe the agreement as the Treaty of Equals, with Hattusili referred to by the same royal titles as Ramses. One particularly telling discrepancy appears in how each side framed the notorious Battle of Kadesh. The Egyptian inscription boasts of Ramses' solitary heroism against overwhelming odds, while the Hittite records matter-of-factly state their forces held the field. These weren't accidental differences in translation. They were deliberate acts of diplomatic theater, allowing each ruler to present the peace as a triumph to their people without technically violating the treaty's actual terms. What's remarkable is how both versions contain identical core provisions: border demarcations, extradition protocols, mutual defense clauses, while wrapping them in opposite political packaging. The Hittite text emphasizes reciprocity with phrases like, "The great king of Hatti will act just as the great king of Egypt acts." Meanwhile, the Egyptian version frames every concession as voluntary generosity. His Majesty has permitted that the children of Hatti may enter Egypt to take whatever they need. This linguistic dance reveals a sophisticated understanding of audience psychology. Ramses couldn't appear weak before his priests and generals, while Hattusili needed to reassure his restive vassals that he hadn't surrendered Hittite sovereignty. The treaty's survival in both forms gives us an unprecedented look at Bronze Age information management. Scholars suspect the negotiators knowingly approved these divergent narratives, recognizing that factual consistency mattered less than political stability. It's a strategy modern leaders might recognize. Think of rival nations today issuing conflicting press releases after summits while quietly cooperating behind the scenes. The real genius lay in crafting an agreement flexible enough to be celebrated in both capitals as a victory, proving that sometimes peace depends not on shared truths, but on carefully constructed parallel fictions that allow pride and pragmatism to coexist. This ancient example of spin holds up a mirror to our own era of tailored news feeds and diplomatic doublespeak. Just as Ramesses' artisans chiseled his preferred reality into temple walls, and Hattusili's scribes curated their version for the royal archives, modern governments still package truths to suit their audiences. The lesson isn't about deception, it's about the uncomfortable compromises required to turn enemies into partners. When the alternative was endless war, perhaps allowing both sides their triumphant narratives wasn't dishonesty, but the price of peace. The choice of Akkadian as the treaty's language wasn't just practical, it was a stroke of diplomatic genius that revealed how deeply these ancient empires understood the psychology of negotiation. Picture the scene: Egyptian and Hittite scribes hunched over clay tablets, painstakingly shaping wedge-shaped cuneiform characters in a tongue native to neither kingdom. This wasn't mere convenience, it was a carefully calculated signal of equality. By adopting the lingua franca of Mesopotamian merchants and diplomats, Ramesses and Hattusili removed any suggestion that one culture's writing system, and by extension, one empire's worldview, held supremacy over the other. Akkadian had become the Bronze Age's equivalent of modern English in international business, a language born in ancient Iraq that had spread through trade networks and imperial correspondence. Its use created a level playing field where neither side could accuse the other of manipulating translations in their native script. Surviving drafts from Hattusa show how scribes often included parallel columns of Akkadian and Hittite, allowing both parties to verify the precise meaning of every clause. This attention to linguistic fairness anticipated modern practices like UN treaties being published in multiple authentic versions, each equally binding. What's fascinating is how this neutral language choice subtly shaped the treaty's tone. Akkadian's cuneiform script, with its hundreds of possible signs, forced conciseness and clarity, unlike the lavish hieroglyphs Ramesses might have used for domestic proclamations. The resulting text reads remarkably businesslike, focusing on concrete obligations rather than poetic flourishes. Compare this to Egyptian temple inscriptions about the same treaty, where flowery phrases like "the breath of life given to Hatti" abound. The Akkadian version simply states, "They shall not attack one another." This linguistic restraint turned the document into what we'd now call a working agreement, stripped of propaganda and designed purely for function. The treaty's multilingual nature also hints at an often overlooked aspect of ancient diplomacy, the role of interpreters. Clay tablets from Hattusa mention scribes fluent in 5 languages, suggesting these negotiations involved real-time translation akin to modern summit meetings. One particularly telling example appears in the treaty's divine witness lists while Akkadian served as the legal framework. The names of gods were carefully rendered in their original Egyptian and Hittite forms, preserving each deity's cultural identity even within a foreign linguistic structure. This linguistic balancing act holds profound lessons for today's globalized world. When the European Union drafts agreements in 24 equally authentic languages or tech giants localize software for regional markets, they're wrestling with the same challenge Ramses and Hattusili faced: how to create shared understanding without erasing cultural distinctiveness. The Akkadian solution, adopting a neutral medium while respecting native expressions, proved so effective that copies of the treaty circulated for generations, becoming a model for later agreements across the ancient Near East. It reminds us that true diplomacy isn't about one side imposing its terms, but about finding common ground in a space where all voices can be heard clearly. When Ramses II welcomed a Hittite princess into his harem, this was no ordinary royal wedding. It was a masterstroke of geopolitical theater designed to turn parchment promises into blood ties. The arrival of Queen Mathoneferia in Egypt marked the culmination of years of delicate negotiations, her journey from Hattusa to Pi Ramses transforming her from foreign royalty into a living bridge between empires. But don't mistake this for a simple marriage of convenience. Every ritual surrounding their union was loaded with calculated symbolism. The dowry reportedly included staggering quantities of silver, gold, and precious stones, not just wealth, but tangible proof of Hittite commitment. Meanwhile, Ramses bestowed upon his new bride an Egyptian name meaning "she who sees Horus, the beloved of Ra," weaving her into Egypt's divine cosmology while subtly asserting cultural dominance. This marital alliance worked on multiple levels. At court, the Hittite princess became a permanent envoy, offering Ramses direct insight into Hittite politics through informal channels no official ambassador could match. Surviving letters reveal how she maintained correspondence with her father, King Hattusili, creating a back-channel for sensitive discussions away from the bureaucratic scrutiny of formal treaties. When disputes later arose over trade routes or border skirmishes, these familial connections allowed for quieter resolutions before tensions could escalate. Yet the real genius lay in how this marriage reshaped public perception. For Egyptian commoners, the pharaoh's ability to secure a foreign princess reinforced his image as a ruler so powerful that even rival dynasties sought his favor. Hittite propaganda, meanwhile, framed the union as evidence of their empire's prestige. Why else would mighty Egypt seek their bloodline? Temple reliefs at Abu Simbel depict the Hittite delegation presenting their princess with pomp typically reserved for vassals bearing tribute, while Hattusa's archives emphasized her role as equal partner in a union of great houses. Beneath the pageantry, however, lurked cold political realities. Royal marriages in the ancient Near East often came with unspoken expiration dates, alliances that lasted only until the next succession crisis or shift in power. What set Ramses and Hattusili's arrangement apart was its integration into the broader treaty framework. The marriage wasn't just a ceremonial capstone, it became an early warning system. When Mathoneferia's entourage reported discontent among Hittite vassals or Egyptian governors tested border agreements, both courts could address tensions before they erupted into violence. This practice of diplomatic marriage reveals a sophisticated understanding of human psychology that still resonates today. Modern leaders exchange state dinners and photo ops where ancient kings traded daughters, but the principle remains the same. Personal connections can grease the wheels of diplomacy in ways formal agreements cannot. The Hittite-Egyptian alliance endured for generations not just because of well-drafted clauses, but because Ramses and Hattusili recognized that treaties signed in ink fade faster than those written in the bonds of family, even if that family was forged in the unromantic fires of Realpolitik. The ripple effects of the Egyptian-Hittite treaty transformed the ancient Near East in ways its signers could scarcely have imagined. For nearly a century after the silver tablet was sealed, the region enjoyed an unprecedented era of stability, what modern scholars call the Pax Hethitica, where caravans moved freely between what had once been warring territories. Egyptian grain ships began docking at Hittite-controlled ports in Syria, while Anatolian silver flowed south to Thebes in quantities archaeologists can still trace through burial goods and temple inventories. This wasn't just commerce, it was the birth of an economic interdependence that made peace more valuable than plunder. Cultural exchanges flourished in this new climate. Hittite physicians studied Egyptian medical scrolls, adopting remedies for eye diseases that combined Nile Valley herbs with Anatolian minerals. Meanwhile, Egyptian artisans started incorporating Hittite motifs into their work, distinctive double-headed eagle symbols appearing on pharaohs' jewelry, a silent testament to cross-border influences. Even religious practices blended, with Hittite storm god Teshub occasionally appearing in Egyptian protective amulets alongside Horus and Isis. These weren't superficial changes, they represented a fundamental shift in how these civilizations viewed one another, not as eternal enemies but as partners in prosperity. The treaty's most enduring legacy might be how it reset regional power dynamics. With Egypt and Hatti no longer draining their treasuries on border wars, both empires could focus on emerging threats, particularly the growing might of Assyria to the east. Clay tablets from Hattusili reveal how Hittite spies monitored Assyrian troop movements, occasionally sharing intelligence with Egyptian counterparts through discreet channels established by the treaty. This unofficial cooperation created a buffer against external aggression, buying both civilizations precious decades of stability. Yet the true measure of the treaty's success lies in its longevity. While most Bronze Age peace agreements collapsed within a generation, this one held firm until the Hittite Empire's mysterious collapse around 1200 BCE, a staggering 60 years of uninterrupted peace. Even more remarkably, evidence suggests successive rulers on both sides renewed the pact voluntarily, adding clauses to address new challenges like climate-induced famines and refugee movements. A fragment from Ramses III's reign references sending emergency grain shipments, according to the oath of our fathers, proving the agreement had transcended its original signatories to become institutional wisdom. What makes this sustained peace so extraordinary is the backdrop against which it endured. The late Bronze Age was a time of cataclysmic upheaval, the so-called collapse of civilizations, that saw empires crumble and cities burn across the Mediterranean. Through droughts, rebellions, and even the seismic event that may have destroyed Hattusili itself, the treaty's framework kept Egypt and Hatti from turning on each other in desperation. In our modern era of short-lived alliances and shifting geopolitical winds, that six-decade testament to diplomatic endurance stands as a quiet rebuke, proof that when crafted with care and mutual interest, peace can outlast even the mightiest thrones. 3,000 years may separate us from Ramesses and Hattusili's silver tablet, but the principles that made their peace treaty endure still hold startling relevance for today's fractured world. At its core, their agreement succeeded because it wasn't about one side winning. It was about both sides calculating that cooperation served their interests better than continued conflict. Modern diplomats often call this the positive-sum game, where compromise creates new opportunities rather than just dividing existing ones. When Egypt gained secure borders and Hatti won breathing room to crush internal rebellions, both empires unlocked economic booms that temple records and trade inventories still reflect. Compare that to zero-sum negotiations where parties haggle over fixed resources, and you'll see why the most durable agreements emerge when all participants leave the table feeling they've gained something tangible. Transparency was another masterstroke these ancient rulers understood intuitively. Unlike secret pacts that breed suspicion, the Egyptian-Hittite treaty was literally carved into temple walls and proclaimed in public squares. This wasn't just about grandstanding, it created accountability. When merchants traveling between Memphis and Hattusili could recite treaty clauses from memory, it became harder for either side to quietly violate terms. Today's equivalent might be the meticulous publication of arms control agreements or trade deals, where public scrutiny acts as an informal enforcement mechanism. The Hittites took this further by depositing treaty copies with neutral city-states like Ugarit, creating third-party verification that predates modern practices like UN document registries by millennia. But perhaps the most ingenious lesson lies in how they enforced compliance without tanks or trade sanctions. By invoking their gods as witnesses, Ramses and Hattusili tapped into something deeper than legal penalties. They leveraged the power of shared belief. In our secular age, we've replaced divine curses with international courts and economic penalties, but the psychological principle remains identical. Effective treaties need consequences that feel inevitable and inescapable to would-be violators. The treaty's Thousand Gods Clause worked because both cultures genuinely feared supernatural retribution. Today's equivalents, like the reputational damage from breaching climate accords or the financial isolation of violating banking sanctions, rely on equally visceral fears of modern curses like market crashes or diplomatic isolation. What's striking is how these Bronze Age diplomats anticipated modern conflict resolution strategies without blueprints or precedents. Their mutual defense clause mirrors NATO Article 5 collective security principle. The fugitive provisions foreshadow contemporary extradition treaties. Even their cultural exchanges, like Hittite physicians studying Egyptian medical texts, parallel today's scientific diplomacy, where joint research projects build trust between rival nations. The greatest testament to their wisdom isn't that we still study their treaty, but that after 3,000 years, we keep rediscovering its principles anew, proof that human nature changes far more slowly than our technologies. Yet one lesson stands above all. The treaty's endurance came from addressing both practical and psychological needs. It didn't just delineate borders, it gave each civilization a narrative of dignity. Egypt could claim generosity, Hatti could assert equality. Modern diplomats wrestling with intractable conflicts might take note. The most lasting solutions aren't just about maps and weapons, but about crafting terms that let all parties tell their people a story they can accept. When Ramses and Hattusili included each other's gods in their oaths, they weren't just hedging celestial bets, they were acknowledging that true peace requires honoring the other side's deepest values. In an era of polarized geopolitics, that ancient insight feels more urgent than ever. The enduring power of the Egyptian-Hittite treaty lies in its revelation that diplomacy transcends the tools of its time, whether etched in cuneiform or encrypted in digital databases. The human dance of negotiation follows timeless rhythms. Consider how those Bronze Age envoys navigated challenges any modern diplomat would recognize. The delicate art of saving face, the strategic use of ambiguity in contentious clauses, the careful calibration of threats and incentives. When Ramses and Hattusili debated border disputes, they weren't just arguing over territory, they were mastering the same psychological chess game played today in United Nations chambers, where the real battle often isn't over land, but over perception and pride. Technology may have changed the speed of communication, but not its substance. Where modern negotiators hop on jets for emergency summits, Hittite messengers spent months traversing mountains and deserts with clay tablets strapped to their backs. Yet both eras share that pivotal moment when a scribe's phrasing, whether in Akkadian cuneiform or diplomatic English, can mean the difference between peace and renewed hostilities. The famous brotherhood language in the treaty, addressing each king as equals, wasn't mere protocol, it was a calculated mirror of today's carefully crafted joint statements, where every adjective carries weight. What truly connects ancient and modern diplomacy is the unspoken rule that successful agreements must give all parties something to celebrate. The treaty's brilliant duality, allowing Ramses to boast of generosity while Hattusili proclaimed parity, finds its echo in contemporary press conferences where rival leaders each claim victory from the same deal. This isn't deceit, it's the essential theater of statecraft, acknowledging that for peace to hold, domestic audiences must believe their side prevailed. The most striking parallel lies in how both eras use cultural symbols as diplomatic currency. Where modern summits exchange state gifts, a ceremonial sword here, a signed sports jersey there, Ramses and Hattusili traded statues of their gods, embedding spiritual significance into political acts. A recently discovered Hittite tablet describes how Egyptian physicians were sent north during a plague outbreak, their healing arts serving as both humanitarian gesture and soft power projection, an ancient precursor to modern vaccine diplomacy. Yet perhaps the greatest lesson is how these ancient empires institutionalized their peace. They didn't just sign a document, they embedded it in temple rituals, royal marriages, and even children's education. School tablets from Hattusa show scribbled students copying treaty clauses as writing exercises, ensuring generations would internalize its terms. That multi-layered approach combining legal, cultural, and educational reinforcement mirrors how lasting modern agreements like the Geneva Conventions permeate societies through military training, international law curricula, and media narratives. The silver tablet may have tarnished, but its principles still gleam. That true diplomacy isn't about imposing solutions, but crafting frameworks where former enemies become stakeholders in each other's stability. When 21st century negotiators wrestle with cyber warfare or climate accords, they're walking the same tightrope Ramses and Hattusili navigated, balancing national interest with collective survival, proving that while the tools of peacemaking evolve, the wisdom required to wield them effectively remains remarkably constant. Trust didn't come easily between Ramses II and Hattusili III. It was painstakingly constructed, clause by clause, envoy by envoy, over years of tense negotiations. These were rulers who had spent their formative years leading armies against each other, their names etched into battlefield monuments as mortal enemies. Yet the treaty they crafted reveals an almost modern understanding of how trust operates in diplomacy, not as a naive leap of faith, but as a series of verifiable, incremental steps designed to prove reliability. One of their most ingenious mechanisms was the establishment of regular communication channels, what we'd now call confidence-building measures. Unlike previous Bronze Age agreements that might lapse into silence after signing, their treaty mandated annual exchanges of envoys bearing official greetings and updates. These weren't just ceremonial gestures, they created constant opportunities to address grievances before they festered into crises. The treaty's dispute resolution system functioned like an ancient hotline. When border skirmishes or trade disputes arose, as they inevitably did, local commanders were forbidden from taking unilateral action. Instead, they had to immediately notify their superiors, triggering a formal process where Hittite and Egyptian officials would jointly investigate. Clay tablets from Hattusa document one such case where Egyptian merchants were accused of smuggling weapons into Hittite territory. Rather than seizing the goods and risking escalation, Hittite border guards followed protocol. They detained the caravan and sent word to Hattusili, who in turn dispatched a messenger to Ramses. Within months, a joint tribunal of Egyptian and Hittite judges reviewed the evidence at a neutral site, ultimately ruling the weapons were actually mining tools. This meticulous attention to procedural fairness transformed potential flashpoints into demonstrations of the treaty's effectiveness. What's remarkable is how these ancient leaders institutionalized trust through transparency. The treaty required both parties to share intelligence about potential external threats, an extraordinary demand in an era when knowledge was power. When Assyrian forces began massing near Hittite borders around 1250 BCE, Hattusili didn't conceal his vulnerability. He informed Ramses, knowing full well the pharaoh might exploit this weakness. Instead, Egyptian scouts were soon spotted monitoring Assyrian movements, their presence sending a clear deterrent signal. This reciprocal vulnerability created what modern political scientists call hostage to trust, a situation where both sides have enough compromising information about each other that betrayal becomes mutually assured destruction. The human element proved equally vital. Personal bonds between negotiators forged over years of back and forth diplomacy developed into genuine rapport. Letters between Ramses and Hattusili evolved from stiff formalities into surprisingly warm correspondence, with the Hittite king once writing, "Are we not bound by the love of brothers?" When Hattusili's daughter journeyed to Egypt as Ramesses' bride, she didn't travel as a political pawn but as a living embodiment of this hard-won trust, accompanied by physicians and artisans who would spend years exchanging knowledge between the courts. This cultural intermingling created constituencies for peace on both sides: bureaucrats, traders, and priests, whose livelihoods now depended on continued cooperation. Perhaps the treaty's most profound psychological insight was its recognition that trust isn't static. The inclusion of renewal ceremonies every 5 years, where envoys would ritually reaffirm the terms before new witnesses, acknowledged that alliances require constant maintenance. During one such renewal, when Ramesses sent a statue of the god Ptah to Hattusa as a goodwill gesture, Hattusili reciprocated by dispatching sacred Hittite relics to Thebes. These weren't just religious exchanges, they were tangible reminders that the treaty remained a living, evolving entity. The lesson for our era is clear. Trust between adversaries isn't about forgetting past conflicts, but about creating systems that make future cooperation more rewarding than betrayal. Ramesses and Hattusili didn't achieve this through vague promises, but through concrete mechanisms: regular communication, transparent dispute resolution, and cultural exchange that transformed suspicion into something far more powerful: the certainty that peace served both empires better than war. In an age of fractured international relations, their example reminds us that the strongest treaties aren't written on parchment, but in the daily choices to honor commitments, even when tempted to do otherwise. The peace between Egypt and Hatti didn't just silence swords, it opened floodgates of creativity, commerce, and shared knowledge that reshaped both civilizations. Along the bustling trade routes that once funneled armies, caravans now carried something far more transformative: ideas. Egyptian blue faience beads turned up in Hittite noblewomen's tombs, while Anatolian silver flowed south to adorn Theban temples. But this exchange went deeper than luxury goods. Hittite scribes adopted Egyptian hieratic numerals for accounting, streamlining commerce between empires, while Egyptian physicians incorporated Hittite herbal remedies into their medical scrolls, remedies we've since identified in the Ebers papyrus under names like the Hatti salve for burns. One of the most striking examples emerged in the arts. Excavations at Hattusa revealed limestone sphinxes with distinctly Egyptian headdresses, yet carved in a hybrid style that fused Nile Valley elegance with Anatolian muscularity. Meanwhile, in Ramesses' new capital of Ramses, wall paintings began featuring Hittite-style kilts and armor on foreign tribute-bearers, a subtle nod to cultural cross-pollination. Even religious practices blended at the edges. The Hittite storm god Teshub sometimes appeared alongside Hathor in borderland shrines, not as a conquered deity but as a respected guest, reflecting how prolonged peace softened the hard lines between pantheons. The movement of people became perhaps the treaty's most profound legacy. With borders secure, skilled laborers migrated freely. Hittite metalworkers brought advanced bronze techniques to Egyptian workshops, while Egyptian architects consulted on Hittite reservoir projects. Tablets from Hattusa's archives mention an Egyptian quarter in the city, where scribes and physicians exchanged knowledge over beer brewed from Nile barley. This wasn't just tolerance, it was active cultural curiosity. A letter from a Hittite prince to Ramesses marvels at Egyptian astronomy, requesting one who understands the stars to visit his court, an early example of academic exchange programs. Language itself became a bridge. While Akkadian remained the diplomatic lingua franca, bilingualism flourished among merchants. A fascinating pottery shard found near Kadesh bears a shopping list written in alternating lines of Hittite hieroglyphs and Egyptian demotic, the ancient equivalent of a trader's cheat sheet. Even children's toys reflected this fusion. Wooden dolls wearing hybrid Egyptian-Hittite dress have been unearthed in both empires, suggesting cultural blending reached into everyday life. The most enduring impact, however, may have been culinary. Ship manifests from Ugarit show Egyptian dates and honey flowing north, while Hittite walnuts and safflower oil headed south. Archaeologists analyzing kitchen middens found coriander previously rare in Hatti becoming commonplace after peace, likely introduced by Egyptian cooks serving in Hittite households. This gastronomic diplomacy extended to royal tables. When Hattusili sent his daughter to marry Ramesses, her entourage included bakers skilled in both cuisines, creating a literal taste of home in Pharaoh's palace. These exchanges remind us that true diplomacy doesn't just prevent conflict, it creates the conditions for civilizations to grow beyond their borders. The treaty's architects likely never imagined their political agreement would lead to Hittite-inspired jewelry in Thebes or Egyptian-style irrigation in Anatolia, but that's the magic of sustained peace. When people move freely, ideas cross-pollinate and cultures interweave. The result isn't just the absence of war, it's the presence of something entirely new. In our modern world of hardened borders and cultural tensions, this ancient lesson resonates deeply. Peace isn't an end point, but a beginning. The peace forged between Egypt and Hatti stood as a towering achievement until the ground beneath it began to crumble. For all its sophistication, the treaty's durability relied on a fragile assumption that both empires would remain standing. Around 1200 BCE, the Hittite Empire, once a colossus straddling Anatolia, began to fracture under a perfect storm of catastrophes. Mysterious invaders, later called the Sea Peoples, razed coastal cities, while drought-induced famines sparked internal revolts. Clay tablets from Hattusa's final years paint a desperate picture. Kings pleading with vassals for grain shipments, garrison commanders reporting abandoned border forts, and scribes ominously noting that the gods have turned their backs. With each collapse of a Hittite provincial capital, another thread in the treaty's fabric unraveled, revealing a hard truth even the most brilliant diplomacy can't overcome. Peace is only as strong as the societies sustaining it. Egypt's response to its allies' collapse exposes the limits of ancient realpolitik. Initially, Ramses III honored the old alliance, sending emergency grain convoys to surviving Hittite strongholds like Carchemish. Temple reliefs at Medinet Habu even boast of Egyptian troops fighting alongside Hittite remnants against the Sea Peoples. But as central authority in Hattusa disintegrated, the treaty's mutual obligations became impossible to enforce. Without a unified Hittite state to reciprocate, Egypt gradually pivoted to securing its own interests, fortifying the Nile Delta against the same chaos consuming its former partner. The once celebrated pact hadn't failed, it had simply outlived the balance of power that birthed it. This unraveling holds sobering lessons for modern diplomacy. Like two trees whose roots become intertwined over decades, the Egyptian-Hittite peace depended on both civilizations remaining upright. When one toppled, the other couldn't sustain the connection alone. Modern parallels abound. Think of Cold War-era arms control treaties rendered obsolete by the Soviet Union's collapse, or how regional alliances fracture when member states descend into civil war. The treaty's fate reminds us that even the most meticulously crafted agreements exist within larger ecosystems of power, where economic stability, institutional resilience, and external shocks play decisive roles. Yet there's a poignant coda to this story. Fragments of correspondence found at Ugarit reveal that long after Hattusa's fall, petty kings in Syria, former Hittite vassals, still invoked the old treaty's terms when writing to Egypt, desperately clinging to its legitimacy like a life raft in turbulent seas. Even in ruins, the agreement's prestige endured, a testament to how deeply its principles had taken root. This lingering shadow of diplomacy suggests that while peace may be fragile, the idea of peace, once proven possible, can transcend the civilizations that created it, leaving blueprints for future generations to rediscover and rebuild. Modern technology has peeled back layers of time, revealing secrets of the Egyptian-Hittite treaty that scholars could only dream of deciphering a century ago. Advanced imaging techniques now allow researchers to scan weathered cuneiform tablets and temple inscriptions at a microscopic level, detecting subtle tool marks and erased sections invisible to the naked eye. One breakthrough came when spectral imaging uncovered traces of a previously unknown clause on a Hittite tablet, faint impressions left by a scribe's stylus that had been smoothed over and rewritten. This digital archaeology revealed how negotiators had initially proposed harsher penalties for border violations before settling on more balanced terms, showing diplomacy's evolution in real time across clay drafts. Linguistic analysis software has revolutionized our understanding of the treaty's nuanced language. By comparing word frequencies and grammatical structures between the Egyptian and Hittite versions, algorithms detected systematic differences in how each side framed obligations. The Akkadian text uses passive constructions for Egyptian commitments, grain shall be given, but active voice for Hittite ones, we will send troops, subtle choices that preserved both rulers' dignity. Even more fascinating are the emotion-tracking algorithms applied to royal correspondence, revealing how Ramesses' early letters bristle with formal hostility, while later messages adopt warmer greetings as trust solidified. These digital tools transform ancient words into emotional timelines, letting us witness rapport building across years of negotiation. Ground-penetrating radar has unearthed physical evidence of the treaty's impact beyond palace walls. Surveys along the former border zones show how fortified outposts were gradually replaced by sprawling caravanserais, guesthouses for merchants, with architectural features blending Egyptian and Hittite styles. Chemical analysis of storage jars found at these sites tells an economic story. Vessels that once held military rations were repurposed for trading olive oil and wine, their residue layers marking the precise timeline of peace's dividends. Perhaps the most startling revelation came when CT scans examined the famous silver tablet replica at Istanbul's Museum of Anatolian Civilizations. While the original treaty tablet remains lost, this ceremonial copy showed under its surface a hidden layer of gold foil, proof that the ancients understood the power of symbolism. The gold backing would have made the tablet shimmer when held to light, visually reinforcing its divine importance during public readings. Such discoveries remind us that for Bronze Age diplomats, every material choice carried meaning, from the metals they used to the very clay that preserved their words across millennia. These technological leaps do more than satisfy historical curiosity. They correct long-standing misconceptions. Early 20th century scholars, relying on incomplete translations, once portrayed the treaty as Egypt imposing terms on a weakened Hatti. But multispectral imaging of damaged tablet sections combined with database comparisons of similar era treaties now prove it was a true negotiation. The Hittites weren't passive recipients. Their counter-proposals appear in margin notations and clay tablet drafts, showing active participation in shaping every clause. This digital archaeology restores agency to both civilizations, revealing ancient diplomacy as a dynamic conversation rather than a dictated peace. The most poignant application of this technology bridges past and present. At the Temple of Karnak, where Ramses immortalized the treaty, laser scans have created millimeter-perfect 3D models of the hieroglyphs. These digital twins now allow Egyptian and Turkish schoolchildren to collaboratively explore the inscriptions through virtual reality, their avatars tracing the same cartouches that once sealed an empire's fate. In labs from Chicago to Ankara, artificial intelligence cross-references treaty phrases with thousands of other Bronze Age documents, uncovering previously unnoticed diplomatic patterns that shaped the ancient world. What emerges from these high-tech investigations is a humbling truth. Our understanding of history is never static. Each technological advance, whether X-ray fluorescence revealing a scribe's corrections or neural networks reconstructing fragmented texts, adds new dimensions to this 3,000-year-old agreement. The treaty endures not just as a relic behind glass, but as a living lesson in how societies choose between destruction and dialogue, its echoes growing clearer with every innovation that lets us listen more closely to the past. Some modern interpretations paint the Egyptian-Hittite treaty as an act of desperation, two exhausted empires settling for a temporary ceasefire when neither could land a decisive blow. But this couldn't be further from the truth. Far from a stopgap measure, the agreement represented a deliberate reimagining of international relations, one so meticulously designed that its framework outlasted the reigns of its original signatories. The misconception stems from projecting modern assumptions onto ancient contexts, assuming that because these civilizations valued martial glory, any peace must have been a reluctant compromise. Yet the treaty's very durability disproves this. Temporary truces in the Bronze Age rarely lasted more than a harvest cycle, while Ramses and Hattusili's pact endured for generations, surviving palace coups, succession crises, and even natural disasters that reshaped the region. Another persistent myth suggests the treaty favored one empire over the other, often casting Egypt as the dominant party. This distortion largely stems from Ramesses' prolific temple propaganda, which naturally framed every diplomatic act as Pharaoh's benevolent concession. But the Hittite archives tell a different story, one of hard-won parity. Clause by clause, the agreement reflects careful balancing. Egyptian grain shipments matched Hittite military support. Border adjustments favored neither side disproportionately, and the famous mutual defense obligations were explicitly reciprocal. Even the divine curses invoked equal numbers of Egyptian and Hittite deities, a symbolic equilibrium that wouldn't exist in a lopsided arrangement. Perhaps the most damaging misconception is that ancient diplomacy lacked sophistication compared to modern statecraft. Skeptics imagine Bronze Age rulers as warlords who only understood force, dismissing the treaty as a primitive precursor to a real diplomacy. Yet the document's provisions reveal astonishing nuance articles addressing refugee status, extradition protocols, and even intellectual property forbidding the theft of sacred texts. The negotiators anticipated scenarios modern treaties still grapple with: how to verify compliance without satellite imagery, how to prevent third-party provocations from sparking conflicts, and how to build trust between societies with deep cultural differences. The treaty's afterlife also dispels myths about ancient short-term thinking. Unlike fleeting victory monuments, this agreement was designed for posterity. Both empires deposited copies in their most enduring mediums, Egypt in stone, Hatti in fired clay, and integrated its terms into civic rituals. School tablets from Hattusili show scribes in training copying treaty clauses as writing exercises, while Egyptian temple reliefs depict its ratification as a divine mandate. This wasn't just record-keeping, it was institutional memory-building, ensuring future generations would inherit not just the peace, but the philosophy behind it. What these misconceptions obscure is the treaty's true revolutionary nature. In an era when conflict was the default and peace often meant mere absence of war, Ramses and Hattusili envisioned something radical: a positive peace that actively created stability through interdependence. Their grain-for-security exchanges functioned like an ancient version of economic integration, making cooperation more profitable than confrontation. When later Hittite kings faced famine, they didn't raid Egyptian stores. They invoked the treaty's terms, knowing preserved trust was more valuable than plundered wealth. The greatest testament to the agreement's sophistication lies in what it didn't include: no victor, no vanquished, no humiliating reparations. Unlike the punitive treaties that would later define antiquity, think Rome's crushing terms for Carthage, this was a peace built on mutual interest, not domination. That balance explains why it survived while so many others collapsed. For modern observers quick to dismiss ancient statecraft as crude or transient, the Egyptian-Hittite treaty stands as a quiet rebuke, proving that 3,000 years ago, diplomats understood timeless truths. Lasting peace requires dignity for all parties, systems that reward compliance, and the wisdom to know that the most enduring victories aren't won on battlefields, but at negotiate tables. Ramses II understood something modern leaders still grapple with: art doesn't just reflect power, it amplifies it. Across the towering walls of Karnak and the sun-baked cliffs of Abu Simbel, artisans chiseled scenes of the treaty's ratification with cinematic grandeur. But these weren't neutral historical records. Every chisel stroke served a purpose: to transform a negotiated compromise into a spectacle of divine theater. In one famous relief, Ramses stands with arm raised, not in battle but in benediction, offering peace to diminutive Hittite envoys who kneel as if receiving salvation. The hieroglyphs above them leave no ambiguity. The mighty sword of Egypt is sheathed by Pharaoh's wisdom, proclaims one caption, framing mercy as an act of strength rather than concession. What makes these artworks so revealing is their dual audience. For foreign dignitaries visiting Egypt, the reliefs broadcast an unmistakable message. Rebellion against Ramses wasn't just futile, it was sacrilege. Yet for domestic viewers, they performed a subtler alchemy. By depicting Hittite envoys bearing lavish gifts, gold rings, exotic animals, precious woods, the scenes reassured Egyptian elites that peace came with material rewards. Even the gods got a starring role. Ammon and Ra hover approvingly above the proceedings, their presence turning statecraft into cosmic destiny. This wasn't mere decoration. It was psychological conditioning on a civilizational scale, using art to equate diplomacy with divine will. The Hittites employed their own cultural arsenal. While their clay tablets lacked Egypt's visual splendor, they compensated with poetic language. Treaty copies found at Hattusili describe the pact as binding like the mountains, unshakable like the foundations of heaven, metaphors that resonated in a society where nature's permanence symbolized order. When Hattusili sent his daughter to marry Ramses, the delegation reportedly included musicians performing a newly composed Song of Two Lands, its lyrics celebrating unity through the imagery of intertwined rivers. These artistic flourishes served the same purpose as Egypt's stone carvings, to make abstract political concepts feel tangible and timeless. Literature became another battleground for hearts and minds. Ramses' scribes produced epic poems recasting Kadesh, a near disaster for Egypt, as a prelude to his magnanimous peace. One verse unearthed at Pi, Ramses declares, "The lion lays down with the lamb not from weakness but from boundless strength." Meanwhile, Hittite scribes wove the treaty into royal annals as proof of their empire's prestige, emphasizing how the son of Egypt sought the moon of Hatti as equals. This narrative jousting reveals a profound truth. Ancient diplomacy wasn't confined to tablet and parchment. It lived in the stories societies told about themselves. The most enduring artistic legacy, however, emerged from cultural exchange. A previously unknown fresco discovered in a Hittite governor's palace shows Egyptian and Hittite soldiers feasting together, their weapons stacked peacefully in corners, a scene unimaginable during wartime. Similarly, Egyptian love poetry from the period suddenly features Anatolian musical instruments like the lyre, suggesting how peace opened floodgates of creative cross-pollination. These artifacts remind us that treaties do more than halt conflicts. They reshape how civilizations see each other, replacing enemy caricatures with nuanced human connections. What Ramses and Hattusili grasped was that lasting peace requires more than legal clauses. It needs stories people believe in. Their fusion of art and statecraft created something revolutionary, a peace that felt inevitable rather than imposed, celebrated rather than endured. In our age of sterile press releases and forgettable summits, their example whispers across millennia. The treaties that endure are those woven into the very fabric of culture, where stone and song become their guardians. Centuries after Ramesses and Hattusili's silver tablet faded from memory, their revolutionary approach to peace resurfaced in ways they could never have imagined. The treaty's DNA, its emphasis on reciprocity, public accountability, and mutual interest became the hidden blueprint for diplomacy across ages. When Assyrian King Ashurbanipal negotiated with Elamite rulers in the 7th century BCE, his scribes borrowed the Egyptian-Hittite formula of invoking dual pantheons as witnesses. A millennium later, Byzantine emperors and Persian shahs echoed its border protocols in their own truces, adapting the concept of demilitarized zones first codified in the ancient Near East. Even the famous Peace of Westphalia in 1648, often hailed as the birth of modern international relations, carried faint whispers of that Bronze Age innovation, with its recognition of sovereign equality and territorial integrity. What made this treaty so endlessly adaptable wasn't just its clauses, but its underlying philosophy. The notion that peace could be structured rather than simply declared, that it required systems for dispute resolution, mechanisms for verification, and incentives for compliance, transformed how civilizations approached conflict. Roman diplomats negotiating with Carthage inserted escape clauses modeled on the treaty's famine provisions, while medieval Italian city-states replicated its annual envoy exchanges to prevent trade wars. The Venetian archives contain 13th century documents referring explicitly to the Egyptian precedent when brokering maritime treaties, proving how far its influence traveled. Modern international law owes more to these ancient negotiators than we often acknowledge. The Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, the bedrock of today's embassy systems, mirrors the treaty's protections for envoys. Refugee protections in the Geneva Conventions trace their roots to those nuanced distinctions between political fugitives and displaced commoners. Even the United Nations Charter's collective security principle feels eerily familiar to anyone who studied Hattusili and Ramses' Mutual Defense Pact. The real testament to its legacy lies in how its core ideas transcended the empires that created them. When archaeologists unearthed copies of the treaty in the 19th century, European diplomats grappling with the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars saw startling relevance in its balanced approach. A young Henry Dunant, future founder of the Red Cross, reportedly kept a translation in his Geneva office, citing its humanitarian provisions as inspiration for the First Geneva Convention. Today, negotiators from Camp David to Kyoto unconsciously channel ancient scribes every time they craft agreements where all parties gain something tangible, proving that while our tools have evolved from clay tablets to encrypted emails, the art of building trust remains timeless. Perhaps most remarkably, this 3,000-year-old agreement anticipated dilemmas we still wrestle with. Its divine curses have become modern, snapback sanctions, automatic penalties for treaty violations. The annual envoy exchanges foreshadowed confidence-building measures in nuclear arms control. Even its dual-language format finds echoes in contemporary bilingual treaties like the 1906 Algeciras Act. The lesson isn't that ancient diplomats had all the answers, but that they asked the right questions. How do you make peace more valuable than war? How do you enforce agreements without overwhelming force? How do you turn former enemies into stakeholders in each other's stability? In the quiet corridors of the United Nations headquarters, where delegates debate crises from climate change to cyber warfare, a replica of the Egyptian-Hittite treaty sits displayed near the Security Council chamber. It's not there as a relic, but as a reminder that the greatest breakthroughs in human coexistence often come not from inventing new solutions, but rediscovering old wisdom. When modern mediators speak of win-win outcomes or conflict prevention architectures, they're speaking the language first written in cuneiform and hieroglyphs. The silver tablet may have tarnished, but its principles still gleam, a proof that even in our fractured world, the past holds blueprints for building bridges. In today's world of fractured alliances and escalating tensions, the Egyptian-Hittite treaty stands as a beacon proof that even the bitterest rivals can forge paths to peace when the cost of conflict becomes too steep. Consider the parallels, like Ramses and Hattusili facing external threats from Assyria and internal rebellions. Modern superpowers navigate pressures from rising economies and domestic unrest. The treaty's genius was recognizing that true security isn't built on dominance alone, but on structures that make cooperation more rewarding than confrontation. Take NATO collective defense principle, an echo of that ancient mutual aid clause, or the painstaking verification measures in nuclear arms control, mirroring how both empires deposited treaty copies with neutral city-states for transparency. What makes this 3,000-year-old agreement feel startlingly contemporary is its rejection of zero-sum thinking. The treaty didn't just freeze hostilities, it created active incentives for peace through trade corridors and cultural exchanges. Modern economic interdependencies like German industry relying on Russian gas or Taiwanese semiconductors powering iPhones serve a similar function, making conflict economically unthinkable for rational actors. Yet the Bronze Age diplomats went further, embedding psychological safeguards too. The divine curses tapped into deep-seated fears, much like today's deterrence of reputational ruin or financial sanctions that make treaty violations more trouble than they're worth. The treaty's emphasis on face-saving narratives holds particular resonance in our age of hyper-nationalism. Just as Ramses framed the pact as magnanimity while Hattusili spun it as equality, contemporary leaders from Beijing to Washington craft summit declarations allowing domestic audiences to claim victory. The 2015 Iran nuclear deal exemplified this, with Tehran heralding it as resistance to imperialism and Western powers touting non-proliferation wins. Like those ancient scribes carefully balancing Akkadian phrasing, modern diplomats know lasting agreements must let all parties walk away with dignity intact. Perhaps the most urgent lesson lies in the treaty's long-term perspective. While today's headlines chase instant wins, Ramses and Hattusili invested in systems annual envoy exchanges, dispute resolution protocols that sustain peace across generations. Climate accords and pandemic response frameworks attempt similar institutional staying power, but often lack the cultural embedding that made the treaty endure. When Hittite schoolchildren copied its clauses as writing exercises, or Egyptian temple rituals celebrated its anniversaries, they turned diplomacy from parchment into lived tradition. In an era where international agreements are easily scrapped by successor governments, this ancient model whispers a radical idea: peace must be woven into a society's identity to outlast political cycles. The ultimate testament to the treaty's relevance isn't in dusty museum cases, but in the quiet ways its principles persist. Ukrainian and Russian negotiators referencing century-old borders during peace talks, ASEAN nations invoking the spirit of Bandung to diffuse tensions. These are modern iterations of that Bronze Age insight. That conflict resolution thrives when rooted in shared history and mutual interest. As climate change and AI governance demand unprecedented global cooperation, the treaty reminds us that the greatest diplomatic breakthroughs aren't about inventing new tools, but rediscovering timeless truths. That trust is built incrementally, that compromise isn't surrender, and that even empires built on conquest can choose a different legacy when they dare to see enemies as future partners. The Egyptian-Hittite peace treaty isn't just a faded inscription on a museum wall. It's a living testament to humanity's enduring capacity to choose dialogue over destruction. Think about the sheer improbability of this moment in history. Two superpowers steeped in generations of bloodshed sat across a negotiating table and did something revolutionary. They recognized that their futures were intertwined. That silver tablet didn't just end a war, it shattered the illusion that conflict is inevitable. In our modern world of polarized politics and geopolitical brinkmanship, their example crackles with urgency. What's startling is how contemporary their challenges feel. Ramses and Hattusili grappled with border disputes, refugee crises, even climate pressures. Anatolian droughts and Nile floods feature prominently in their correspondence. Their solution wasn't to double down on isolation, but to weave a safety net of mutual dependence. When famine struck Hatti, Egyptian granaries opened. When Assyria massed troops, Hittite scouts shared intelligence. This wasn't naive idealism. It was hard-nosed pragmatism, recognizing that some storms are too vast for any one nation to weather alone. The treaty's most radical lesson lies in its rejection of winner-takes-all diplomacy. Modern negotiators could learn from how neither empire was forced to kneel, how Hattusili preserved his sovereignty while Ramses saved face. Today's peace talks often stumble over symbolic wounds, disputed names, contested histories, the specter of humiliation. Yet 3 millennia ago, these ancient diplomats crafted language that let both civilizations claim dignity. Their secret, they understood that lasting agreements aren't built on concessions, but on making every party feel like they've gained something worth protecting. Consider how they transformed enforcement from threat to ritual. Those elaborate ceremonies where envoys exchanged treaty copies weren't just pageantry, they created psychological stakes. By having priests chant the terms before crowds and depositing copies in temples, they turned legal text into sacred covenant. Modern equivalents might be public ratification votes or live-streamed treaty signings, anything that roots commitments in collective witness. The genius was recognizing that compliance thrives when violations don't just break rules but betray shared values. This brings us to the treaty's quiet masterstroke, its generational thinking. Unlike today's short-term political cycles, Ramses and Hattusili engineered their pact to outlive them. Schoolchildren memorized its clauses, artisans depicted it in temple art, and successive rulers renewed it voluntarily. They planted peace not just in palaces but in the soil of culture itself, in an era where international agreements are routinely scrapped by incoming administrations. This long-game perspective feels revolutionary. As you reflect on this ancient breakthrough, ask yourself, what would our global challenges look like if we applied their blueprint? Climate accords with mutual aid clauses as binding as those grain for security exchanges. Trade deals that, like their artisan exchange programs, prioritize cultural bridges alongside economic ones. Perhaps even a modern equivalent of those divine witnesses, not supernatural, but mechanisms that make treaty violations socially and politically unthinkable. The next time headlines declare diplomacy impossible, remember the Bronze Age envoys who crossed war-torn landscapes with clay tablets instead of weapons. They proved that peace isn't about erasing differences, but about crafting structures where cooperation becomes the rational choice. Their legacy whispers across millennia. The tools change, but the art remains. Now it's our turn to pick up the chisel. What ancient diplomatic tactic do you think would most benefit today's world? Drop your thoughts below. And if you've enjoyed this journey into history's first great peace deal, don't forget to subscribe. Who knows, the next video might just reveal how another forgotten artifact holds the key to understanding our present.